Hi, my name is Rina Gashumba. I'm a Public Information Officer at the International Labour Organization, and today we will be discussing equal pay for equal work and overcoming the gender pay gap. So today we're lucky enough to have an expert on the topic. I'm joined by Rosalia Vasquez Alvarez, who is a wage specialist on the conditions of work and the Equality Department at the International Labour Organization. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rena, for having me here. Thank you.
I would also like to welcome the audience and to remind the audience that this is being recorded live. So please feel free to send your questions throughout this Facebook Live, and I will be directing them to Rosalia. So, on the topic, globally, the gender pay gap is currently at 20%. So that means that men are earning around 20% more than women. So this estimate has persisted for around the last 20 years. And if concrete actions aren't taken, this may persist well into the future. So today we will be discussing how can we close the gender pay gap, and also what is the International Labour Organization doing to help. So firstly, Rosalia, I would like to ask you, what is the gender pay gap and why does it exist?
Well, the gender pay gap is difficult to explain because it's a very complicated item to really understand. But as you have said very well at the beginning, it's basically the difference between what women and what men earn, usually as percentage of what men earn. And as you have said before at the beginning, on average we would say that the gender pay gap worldwide is about 20%. So women are earning about 20% less than what men earn. Now, why does it exist? Well, again, this is a difficult question to answer because there are many factors that can be thought as determining the gender pay gap nowadays. But we could say that women have advanced in society and therefore in the labor market at a pace that has been faster than what the actual structure of the labor market has done. And this mismatch in adaptation is what has determined the fact that women are perhaps lagging behind in terms of doing as, not they're doing just as well as men, but basically they're not having the same equal opportunities as men in the labor market. And the gender pay gap is simply a reflection of this lack of this mismatch between what the labor market actually offers women and what the women can actually offer the labor market given their capacities, given their situation today in the society.
Okay, thank you. So some people argue that it's impossible to eliminate the gender pay gap because women are the ones bearing children. So this often impacts their careers. So what would you say to this argument? What would you say to this idea?
Well, I mean, it is true that women are bearing children, but children is a matter for women and men equally. So what happens is that women usually bear the cost in their careers of bearing children. Now, the reality is that it is true that the fact that women are the ones that have children impacts in their careers and impacts in the way in which they participate in the labor market. But it's not the only factor. As we will be able to talk about later on, many other factors have an impact on the fact that women earn less than men. And one of the estimates, or one of the, let's say, facts that we can put forward to make sure that people understand that it's not this the main factor, is if we look at the actual gender pay gap at the entry point, when people are very young and start in the labor market. One thing we can say is that right at that entry point, when men and women are very young, when they're not even thinking about children, when they don't have children, and if we compare the men and women who are fairly similar in terms of skills, education, etc., we already observed the gender pay gap there. So therefore, we can already say that it's not the only factor that determines the gender pay gap.
Okay. So, in your view, has pay equity advanced in recent times? And also, are some regions doing better than others? If so, could you give some examples?
Well, what we can say, or what we will observe from the data, is that if we look at the gender gap today, we would say there is a stagnation of the gender pay gap. So now, how it has advanced is difficult to say for different regions or for different countries because we don't have the data to go back decades ago to try to understand how this has advanced. But where we have data, for example, in the case of the U.S., we can say that the gender pay gap declined significantly from the starts of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And since, say, the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, this has stagnated at about 20%. So, for example, in the case of the US, in the 1960s, 70s, the gender pay gap was around 40%. So women would earn 40% less than men. Today, they earn about 20% less. This is the same for the European Union, for example. There's another region for which we have data for a longer period. But it has actually stagnated at about 20%, say, in the past 10 to 15 years. And it hasn't moved a great deal, despite the fact that there had been initiatives to try to reduce the gender pay gap. Now, if we think about different regions in the world, well, again, as I said before, we don't have the data to be able to compare the different regions. But another thing is that it's difficult to compare regions because labor markets are very different in different regions. For example, in the Arab economies, in the Arab regions, in Middle East, African countries, or in the Gulf countries, what we find is that women, the participation of women is very low. And there is a tendency to participate in sectors where women are actually earning a higher earnings because they are probably higher educated women who tend to participate in the labor market. So the gender pay gap is actually very low in these regions, not so much because there is less difference between men and women, but because participation is very specific in these regions. So you see, that's how we can actually say that we cannot really compare what goes on between regions or how regions have advanced in terms of reducing the gender pay gap.
Okay. This leads well onto our next question, which is about the disparity between higher paid women and lower paid women. So how does the gender pay gap differ amongst the different levels of earnings?
Well, I mean, that's actually a very good question because when we think about the gender pay gap, usually we think about the average difference between men and women. But the reality is that it depends very much on where women are located in terms of the wage distribution. And we take all men and women in the labor market in any country and we rank them according to how much they earn. What we find is that those women who are at the beginning of this ranking, those who are earning less, are the ones that perhaps have the lower gender pay gap. And the women who are earning more in the labor market, those women who are perhaps participating with higher education, higher experience, those women are compared to men who are similar to them in terms of these human capital characteristics like age, education, experience, these women are actually finding a greater gap between them and those men who are similar to them in terms of these characteristics. So women at the low end, those are less likely to suffer a higher gender pay gap. Women at the high end suffer a higher gender pay gap. Now, I say women, but I also want to say society in general suffers a higher gender pay gap. But one thing that we must understand also is that the number of women at the low end are very large. So if we think about on aggregate, it is true that although it's less of a gender pay gap, on aggregate it has a bigger impact in terms of the earnings that women receive in the labor market.
So I would just like to take this opportunity to remind the audience to be sending in your questions, and I'll direct those questions to Rosalia. Thank you. So you were just talking about women in the lower end of the pay gap. So research shows that women are choosing lower paid jobs. Could you explain why?
Well, I wouldn't say that women are choosing lower paid jobs. One thing we find with the data, with all the research that we do here at the ILO and also the research done in other institutions, is that in general, what we see is a polarization in the labor market. There is a tendency for women to participate in occupations and in economic sectors where the average wage is low, whereas in economic sectors where there is more men in terms of the proportion in that sector of relative to women, the wages are relatively higher. Now, one of the reasons why this may be the case is also the way in which we have advanced in the labor market. So at the beginning, when women started to participate in the labor market, they did so in sectors that somehow were associated with the care economy, with very much the service sector, health, education, And in these sectors, when they started to participate, let's just say that they were less valued, and therefore wages were lower. And this has persisted over time, and it has reached at a particular point in time where actually women are more likely to participate in these sectors that somehow are less. The average wage is lower, or somehow the society values them less. But it doesn't mean that women have a tendency to pick up jobs where pay is lower. That's not actually the case. It's let's just say it's another way to define the phenomenon that would actually explain why women actually are getting a lower pay. So in reality, what we find is that women, or in sectors which are highly feminized, the average wage is lower, and sectors which are highly masculinized, the average wage is higher. But even in sectors where you have that the average number of women is higher, in those sectors, if you look at the occupations where men are likely more higher represented, in those occupations, the average wage is higher. So this is a situation, is a matter for us to think that it's the occupation and industry mix that determines the average wage, and this has an impact on the gender pay gap.
Okay, thank you. So we have our first question from the audience, and it's from Naringa. And Naringa wants to ask you, gender segregation in some fields of work seems to impact the gender pay gap, as you were just saying. So how to attract more women into jobs such as IT and more men into work such as in the care industry?
Well, actually, that's an extremely good question, and it's one that it does actually reflect one of the, let's say, tendencies that would help to change the gender pay gap, because it's not only women participating in those occupations that are often thought to be more driven by men, like engineering or physics, or more science-oriented. It's also men that are more that should be more likely to, more happy or more likely to participate in those occupations that are usually thought as feminized, like in the nursing occupations or in education. And how to do this? Well, one of the ways to do this is through education, of course, is changing perhaps the perceptions in society and trying to tackle the issue from the very ground base in education, just before we reach the labor market. So this is stereotyping, this idea that we have culturally believed that men should do a particular task and women should do other particular tasks, is something that would certainly, once it changes through measures that have to be related before we arrive in the labor market, is when we will start to see also a change in the gender pay gap. And just to give you an example, for example, in Italy or in the case of Spain, it has been observed that the rise in the percentage of men in nursing has actually led to a greater average wage in that particular occupation and sector. So it's certainly the case that when we find that men participate more in those feminized occupations, the rise in wages actually reduces the gender pay gap between men and women in general in the economy.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question, and this one's from Catherine, and she asks, how do laws and policies impact occupational sex segregation?
Well, actually, laws, it's difficult to think of laws that will impact on occupational segregation, because career path is something that we choose ourselves. But the idea is to think of having an education system that attracts a diversity of individuals within the different sectors and occupations, and so not to be so stereotyped. Now, laws should help us to reduce the gender pay gap by trying to place penalties, certainly, when there is gender discrimination in terms of payment. So laws, for example, like the ones that we find today in countries like in Germany or in countries like in Iceland, are helping to reduce the gender pay gap, because it's not just placing the legal system that you require in order to penalize discrimination, but also making it effective. For example, you can have laws that help you reduce the gender pay gap because they penalize enterprises that discriminate in pay. But unless there is transparency and women understand that they are discriminated, there is no way that you can make these laws effective. So in the case of Germany, for example, now, enterprises that are 50 or higher in size will have to disclose their payments to men and women in the enterprise. And that transparency is what will allow women to know if they are discriminated. In the case of Iceland, enterprises that are greater than 25 now have to have a certification from the government in order to show that they are actually maintaining equal pay for equal work. So that's the sort of thing that will help us, more than having laws that push towards equal occupations. That's the educational system and society at large that has to try to reduce this stereotyping of occupations.
Okay. So we have another question from the audience, and this one's from Rosalind, and she asks about regional differences. So she's asking, are there regional and country differences in the gender pay gap?
Well, certainly there are a lot of differences in the gender pay gap because, first of all, there are different. Let's just say that the evolution of the different economies has been, of course, different, and we cannot really compare the gender pay gap, say, between advanced economies, emerging economies, or low-income countries. So another thing is that the participation behavior in the labor market is very much different in countries, for example, like Europe or countries like Latin America. And just to give you an example of how different it can be, in countries like in Latin America, you find that just about 50% of those people who work do so in the informal sector. Now, informality has a huge impact on the gender pay gap. And clearly there is a huge difference between the gender pay gap just because the characteristics of those people who work in the labor market, but also basically the participation behavior of men and women in the labor market. So there are clear differences in the gender pay gap.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, and this one's from Marimba. So Marimba is asking, are there sectors where gender segregation is more prominent than others?
Yes, clearly we have certain sectors where you have feminization is a reality, such as the health sector and the educational sector, and this is something that we could think of being across all countries and regions. Mm-hmm. And there are certain other sectors, like for example the construction sector, that is highly masculinized. So there is a clear segregation in terms of gender. That is something that if once it's actually reduced, we can think of potentially having a significant impact in reducing the gender pay gap.
Okay. So I'm interested in knowing what are some other challenges that women may be facing in the workforce that also impact the gender pay gap?
Well, again, this actually depends very much on which region we are talking about. I mean, clearly, all regions in the world are facing the same kind of challenges, such as work-life balance, the glass ceiling, certain issues such as polarization of, as we've talked before. But then each region has its specific characteristics that we can think about. For example, if we think about the Arab world or the MENA region, the Middle Eastern Arab region, now in these areas of the world, perhaps the issues such as violence and sexual harassment are one very important factor that determines the participation of women in the labor market and therefore the gender pay gap. Clearly, these are also factors that affect regions such as advanced economies, but not to such a degree. So we can think of many different regions as helping us to understand different factors that will determine not just the gender pay gap, but the participation of women in the labor market, which happens to be an underlying factor behind the gender pay gap.
Okay, thank you. So now would be a good time to understand what is the ILO doing to help reduce the gender pay gap.
Well, actually, the ILO has been always very active in terms of reducing the gender pay gap. And in fact, the ILO, with its conventions, which is a way in which it tries to have an impact in the world of work, the ILO has one of the conventions, which is Convention 100, that tries to aim towards the equal pay for equal work of equal value. So basically, that's one of the ways in which the ILO is trying to reduce the gender pay gap. But apart from conventions, we also have a very new initiative, which is the EPIC initiative, and this stands for the Equal International Pay Coalition. And the Equal Pay International Coalition is a coalition that started in September 2017, and which aims at also trying to eliminate the gender pay gap and to support one of the key Sustainable Development Goals, which is Sustainable Development Goal 8.5, which is the one that tries to target equal pay between men and women. So the Equal Pay Coalition basically has this mission. It's a coalition between the ILO, UN Women, and the OECD, and it basically tries to put forward research, understanding, and promote the policies that would be basically necessary in order for us to reduce the gender pay gap.
Okay. I would like to remind the audience that you can send questions throughout this Facebook Live. And this Facebook Live, in case you've just joined us, is on equal pay for equal work and overcoming the gender pay gap. So the International Labour Organization also produces the Global Wage Report. Could you explain what are some of the key issues in this report and why we're addressing those?
Yes, well, the Global Wage Report is not just about gender pay gaps, is one of these reports that we call a flagship, or one of the main statements of the International Labour Organization. It's produced every 2 years, and it has basically three parts. The first part touches on basically wage trends. The second part is more analytical and tries to understand a specific topic that relates to wages, and the third part is a policy analysis with reference to the two first parts of the report. Now, this time, the forthcoming Global Wage Report, which will be launched at the end of the year, has actually aimed at trying to understand the gender pay gap, and it tries to analyze the gender pay gap from the perspective of individuals and enterprises, and what it tries to do is not just to try to understand what is the gender pay gap, but also how to estimate it, how to come up with a way of estimating it so that it's effective and useful for policy analysis and policy design, and also to try to harmonize the identification of the gender pay gap across many different countries in the world. Because one of the problems that we face when we try to understand the gender pay gap is that there are many different ways of estimating it, and one way in which we would try to eliminate a controversy as to what is the gender pay gap is by trying to harmonize how we identify the gender pay gap. So this is one of the key messages that will come out of the report, as well as to try to understand perhaps what is the difference between the gender pay gap when we estimate it at the level of the enterprise, or when we estimate it across the population.
Okay, thank you. So can you give us some more examples on when good policies have been used to decrease the gender pay gap?
Well, as I said before, I think if we talk about policies, clearly in some of the advanced economies, especially in the European Union, but also in the US, in Australia, as well as other economies that are in low-income countries and emerging economies, there has been a great deal of policies for reducing the gender pay gap, and we can really say that today the gender pay gap is a key topic in the policy agenda of a vast majority of countries. Now, good examples, it's difficult to say what are the good examples, because it's true that, as I said at the beginning, there is a stagnation of the gender pay gap. And the policies that have been placed so far, we would need more evidence and more time to try to understand how they are working in order to reduce the gender pay gap. But as I also said at the beginning, I think countries like Iceland and countries like Germany are putting in place policies that are effective because they go along between the policies and the transparency that you need to make these policies effective. And I think these are very good examples for us to try to reduce the gender pay gap. And of course, Sustainable Development Goals, the idea that we have allowed for one of the Sustainable Development Goals to be fully dedicated to the issue of reducing gender inequalities in the labor market, are a clear example as to how we can actually think of the gender pay gap becoming more prominent in the agenda of countries, and try to understand also how is it going to be for us that we need to address this issue of the gender pay gap.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question coming in from Olga, and she asks, how are the gender pay gap estimations calculated?
Okay, if we want to understand the estimation, basically, imagine that you have the full population of a country in a data set, or you observe them in somehow, and you observe those people who are wage employees. So we don't take into account those people who have their own enterprise or who are on account workers. We just take those people who are wage employees because these are the people who are more subject to policy impact. Who are subject to the policies that are put in place in order to reduce the gender pay gap. Now, we take all women and we rank them from the lowest to the highest. And then we take all men and we rank them from the lowest to the highest. We take the middle person of women and the middle person of men. And we observe their wages. And then we compare the wages of these two middle people and we see what is the difference between their wage. And that's how we would identify the gender pay gap. That's one way of identifying it, because we can also think of comparing differences between different people located in this rank. For example, we can take the 10 people who are the lowest rank and compare men, the 10 lowest, versus women, the 10 lowest. And that's a way of comparing the gender pay gap between men and women at the low end of this ranking. Or we can compare those people who are at the higher end of the ranking. But that's how we actually estimate the gender pay gap.
Thank you. So we have another question from Catherine, and she's asking, how does maternity affect the gender pay gap, and what is the ILO doing to address the gender pay gap as it specifically affects mothers?
Okay, so that's actually a very interesting question because it refers to what we call the parenthood gap. Or basically, what is the difference between women who are mothers and women who are not mothers in the labor market? Now, we have actually observed that there is actually a pay gap between women who have had children and women who have not had children, and both of them participate in paid employment as wage employees. And it is true that it can actually vary according to the number of children that you have, to when you've had your first child, when did you have your last child. The reality is that it exists. And one of the things which is actually very interesting is that when we observe the pay gap between parents who are the men, the fatherhood pay gap, we actually observe the fathers who have men who have had children versus men who have not had children actually receive what we call a pay premium. So men actually receive earnings which are higher than men who actually are not parents. So this is actually something that we try to understand. Why is it the case? And there is far more research that we need to do in order to understand it. We just know that the phenomenon exists. And it's something that, first of all, it's extremely difficult to identify, because in data sets, what we try to identify if the woman has been or not a mother. And sometimes that's only identified if the child still lives in the household. But if the child is not in the household, that's not usually picked up in the data set. So it's very difficult to identify. But it's true that it exists, and it's a phenomenon that does have an impact. Now, what is the ILO trying to do? Well, clearly promote and identify research that tries to explain the gender pay gap based on parenthood gap. That's something that we try to do. And clearly all the policies that will be involved in the promotion of EPIC will be dealing also with the motherhood, the fatherhood, or the parenthood gender pay gap.
So we have one last question, and this is from Martin, and he says, can the motherhood penalty be narrowed by making paid parental leave conditional to a compulsory or equal share for both mothers and fathers?
Well, I think this is a good initiative because it would certainly equalize the value of men and women in the labor market. Because one of the reasons why women perhaps decide or women leave the labor market for long periods is because in a decision of between the father and the mother of who is to leave in order to guarantee the income in the household, is maybe women are taking this choice for stereotyping reasons, for cultural reasons, but also because it's probably not equally valued, the time of women in the labor market as men, because of reasons like the parenthood gap or the motherhood gap or the gender pay gap in general. But basically, if there were laws that it was compulsory for men to also take parental leave, then clearly this will help in terms of reducing the parenthood gap. Another issue is also making available the sufficient services in order for mothers to be able to go back to the labor market when they wish to go back at a lower cost. Because right now, of course, many women decide to remain at home because the cost of going back after having children, it's too high, because the infrastructure in society for them to go back is not there. So that's one of the. So it's not just making compulsory leave for parents, but for fathers, but also making the infrastructure in society to be beneficial for women who want to go back to the labor market and need that income at the household level.
Okay. Thank you. That's all we have time for. That was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
And I would like to also thank the audience for listening into this conversation, and to also remind the audience that there will be another Facebook Live at 5 p.m. today, and it will be on the gig economy and the future of work. So please tune in for our next Facebook Live session. Thank you.